Hi, everyone. We're in Hall E. It's very cozy. Do you feel a little too cozy? No. Hi, I'm Melissa Franklin. I teach physics here and also play with the bookstore to put on these events, the Harvard bookstore. But I'm supposed to read this, so I'm going to read it. But I don't read very well, so I hope you will bear with me. My name is Melissa Franklin. And on behalf of the Harvard Division of Science, Harvard Library, and the Harvard Bookstore, I'd like to welcome you to the latest installment of our Harvard Science Book Docs. It's going to take a while. It's good so far, right? I would really like to welcome you, especially in this room. I feel very happy in this room. So I'm really happy to introduce this event with Erik Hoel, who is presenting his new book, The World Behind the World, Consciousness, Free Will, and the Limits of Science. I have to say, and this isn't written here, it's a pretty amazing book, really easy to read, and wild. As far as I can tell, Erik is writing exactly what he thinks, which is very, very refreshing. I would say he doesn't write like a successful Harvard administrator. Is that a nice thing to say?
I think so.
Okay.
Depends to administrators.
Equally influenced by literature and neuroscience, Hoel's book guides us through the competing theories of consciousness, making the case that we do, in fact, have free will. And along the way, he covers a breadth of topics ranging from integrated information theory and Gödel's incompleteness theorem to Julian Jaynes' cult classic, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, to, and this is the one I want to know about, why Freud was the best thing to ever happen to television. Okay, before we dive into Hoel's book, I have a few housekeeping topics. So we have a couple of events coming up that you might want to know about if you're not just interested in neuroscience. We have Craig Venter, of a guy who sequences DNA. He's going to join us with his book, The Voyage of Sorcerer II. Sorcerer II is a thing that goes in the water. It's a voyage in the water. And on the 21st, Jim Al-Khalili, who is a popular science writer for physics. And he's going to talk about the joy of science, which I understand is something like the joy of sex, but not exactly the same. It's close. Close. I really should just read this, actually. If you want to stay more up to date, you should follow us, Harvard Science Book Talks, subscribe to the Harvard Bookstore, hopefully you do, and then you can see, also we record these lectures and then you can watch them, and they're kind of really good sometimes. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen tonight if I can get through this? I should not be allowed to do this. Is Erik's going to talk for a while about part of his book, and then I'm going to grill him, and then you are going to ask whatever questions you want. So we'll have a mic, and hopefully you can wait for the mic to come to you, and then you can ask your questions. Afterwards, after this, in the Cabot Library, which is, I know it's weird, you have to go up the stairs, past the bathrooms, turn right, and there's the Cabot Library. Well, we will have cheese cubes. Sorry, and some fruit. and there will be book signing. Erik will be at book signing. So if you want to buy a book, Erik will sign it, right?
I will.
Yeah. And I just want to thank the Harvard Bookstore. They're the people who are happily to sell you the books up at the front there, either after or before. And also, they're great partners in this endeavor. Okay, so I'm supposed to introduce you now, but there's so many things to say. You're in the Forbes 30 Under 30. You were in the New York City Emerging Writers as a fellow. You've written in The Atlantic. You've written in Baffler. You've written, your nonfiction has been in the Best American Essays. Basically, the book is well written.
One can say at least that, I think.
Yeah. Yes. Dr. Hoel has his PhD in neuroscience from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, was a postdoc at Columbia, and he was for a year at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton as a scholar, and a research professor at Tufts University that he just left, just to come down here. So he's going to be talking about the world behind the world, and a book, The Next Big Idea Club, I'm a member, calls a fascinating exploration into how the brain creates our conscious experiences. I have to say that when I started reading this book, I thought maybe there would be a fist fight here because Erik says exactly what he thinks, but it's so engaging that I just couldn't stop. And I'm not just saying that, and I'm not paid to say that. Wait, let me just check whether I'm paid to say that. So I'm already fascinated by a lot of the things in here, and I'm really eager to hear Erik talk. So please welcome Erik Hoel.
Thank you, everyone, so much for coming out. And thank you so much to the Harvard Science Center and the Harvard Bookstore for hosting this event. You know, as was just indicated, I think that this is a book where I really am sort of saying what I think. And one reason for that is, you know, when I started thinking about writing a book that might be more geared towards a popular audience rather than just another academic article, I got to thinking of, well, what is the purpose of a popular science book, right? Like obviously it can be to inform, and there's sort of nothing wrong with that. But what can you do with it as a medium that you might not be able to do in like a standard academic article? And I think the answer is often that you can say what you really think. So the way this is going to go is I'll give a little bit of a brief reading, and then talk a little bit, and then do another little brief reading and talk a little bit, and we'll kind of do that for a little while, and then I'll take some questions, get grilled apparently, which I'm looking forward to, and then hopefully also get grilled from the audience as well. Before I start, are there any neuroscientists in the audience? If you could raise your hand, please. I'm so sorry for what I'm about to say. It's not about you, it's me. In the early 1990s, a team of Italian neuroscientists in Parma, Italy, stumbled their way into a supposed scientific breakthrough. They did this by eating lunch. Across from them sat jealous and hungry macaques, monkeys who were in the middle of an experiment as test subjects. Recording electrodes had been snaked into the monkeys' brains, right into the premotor cortex, electrodes that could pick up the individual discharges of firing neurons. In such setups, the neuronal firing is often displayed on a screen or even played out as sound. And when you listen to the pop, pop talk of neurons, as I have, it becomes impossible to not try to interpret them. Pop, pop. What was that? A complaint, a noticing, a shift in attention, an eye movement? The dark totemic eyes of the macaque ask you, what do you hope to discover here? This isn't, they say with a grin, going to go the way you think. So you eat your lunch. And as they did, the researchers in Italy noticed something remarkable. At each bite, pop, pop. Picture the sandwich being lifted, followed by the explosion of live rounds that neurons make when played over a speaker. Yet the monkeys themselves were not moving, and the area of the brain being recorded from, the premotor cortex, was supposed to control merely their hand movements. Somehow the neurons in the movement-dedicated premotor cortex were responding to the hand motions not of the monkeys, but of the humans lifting up their forks to eat the food the monkeys coveted. For monkeys, as anyone who has worked with them know, are the most covetous of all creatures. Aha! Areas of the brain for controlling movement must have a secondary purpose, a kind of timeshare, wherein they also form the neural basis of understanding the actions of others performing the same kind of movement. The discovery, you might have heard of it, was dubbed mirror neurons, which simply refers to a behavior that was occasionally observed in some of these neurons. And over the course of the idea's more than 30-year life cycle, it has embodied the boom and bust narratology that drives neuroscience. A search of PubMed for mirror neurons produces thousands of results, which peaks around 2013 and then falls off. Neuroscientist and best-selling author V.S. Ramachandran promoted it heavily, writing on Edge in 2000 that, quote, the discovery of mirror neurons in the frontal lobes of monkeys and their potential relevance to human brain evolution is the single most important unreported story of the decade. I predict that mirror neurons will do for psychology what DNA did for biology. They will provide a unifying framework and help explain a host of all mental abilities that have hitherto remained mysterious and inaccessible to experiments. Soon after the article, citations began to climb. It was followed up by a very triumphal TED Talk titled "The Neurons That Shaped Civilization." But as you may have guessed, since those early days of hype, the actual mirror neuron literature has descended into what can only be described as a morass of skepticism and vagueness. Indeed, the mirror neuron hypothesis has been walked back so far, there's almost nothing left to the story. It was always the case that only a very few number of neurons showed this mirror-like activity, and some were sensitive to highly specific behaviors, some responded to almost everything. They were extremely reactive to what reward was being given, the angle of view, and the fact that they are supposed to explain something unique about humans just never really materialized. Mirror neurons turn out to not really be unique to humans or even primates. They've been identified in rats and birds. So what do we have at the end? What initially appeared as a straightforward story, a possible narrative on the big question of what makes the human brain so special, ended up sort of slipping away. The initial observation refused to be easily generalized into anything about understanding or causality or control. In other words, it was merely an interesting correlation. And one might respond to this dismissively, admitting that sure, hype is impossible to avoid in neuroscience, and it's bad when it happens, but maintaining it's all self-corrective, all fine in the end. I think that this perspective would make sense if it were the case that mirror neurons were widely recognized to have been disproven or falsified, and everyone could move on. But instead, proponents of the idea have simply complexified their accounts to the point of absurdity. So instead of getting corrected, the hypothesis lives on like the undead. Still true enough to cite, but not really true enough to lead to any actual understanding about how the brain works. And during my time as a neuroscientist, I've seen versions of this story repeat over and over. An initial claim, mirror neurons, grid cells, memory replay and sleep, errors in decision-making come from microlapses in attention, many others, which are often followed by sort of a many years long backing away process as the ideas become so sort of complexified and amorphous that they become unkillable. And I, just to pause here, this was something that I was a little bit shocked to find when I entered graduate school for neuroscience. So I went out and I got my PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, working under Giulio Tonoti, who's one of the leading sleep and consciousness researchers. I was sort of like considered almost like an annoyance in class, I think, by my professors, or at least I suspect as much. In that I would often, ask, okay, so what can we do with this explanation that's going to, actually show that we're understanding something real here? And one of my favorite things to do, which now looking back I can see was indeed incredibly annoying, was to sort of ask whether or not for a neuroimaging study, if you took away all the information about location, if you said, okay, you tell me the results of this study, but don't tell me anything about where in the brain it's happening. Just tell me about how it's happening in the brain, right? What I often found was that there would be no sort of remaining information, which is, exactly the sort of annoying questions you don't want to get from some smart aleck graduate student when you're giving a presentation. But I think that there's a lot of truth to that. That these questions sort of end up being often ignored or swept under the rug. There's an old term called Occam's broom. It is the less popular of Occam's household objects. And Occam's broom is when you're sort of a leading theorist and you use your broom to sweep, the inconvenient stuff underneath the rug. And I think that there was often a lot of Occam's broom going on, and that to me was part of the reason why I ended up writing this book. Is because in the end, this book isn't really some sort of tirade against neuroscience. There's like 11 other chapters or something which aren't about that. But I think it's a use of popular science to be able to actually offer some critiques and even for the people being critiqued, for like, a moment to sort of step outside and take off like our professional masks where like everything really matters, and then go back to questioning, is what we're doing actually very deeply, advancing scientific progress, or not? And one reason why I, became so concerned is that, just to resume reading, I think that after all, neuroscience is just a more complex form of psychology that attempts to ground psychology in the mechanics and dynamics of a very complicated system, the brain, an organ that remains stubbornly hidden behind a wall of bone, and an issue regular psychology, which is an issue a regular psychology doesn't have to deal with. It's for this reason that neuroscience relies heavily on neuroimaging, but this merely adds more sources of statistical variability and opaqueness on top of those already in psychology. And you might be aware, psychology has been undergoing a replication crisis. For the last, roughly 10, 15 years, it's become incredibly apparent that there are some major issues, including stuff that you can still find in textbooks. And I think that there's sort of this open question of, well, neuroscience is a lot, just speaking very broadly, neuroscience is a lot like psychology, but it's sort of even harder, right? So I think we should expect that a lot of the problems in that field, eventually sort of seep down into neuroscience. And most neuroimaging conducted in humans doesn't even analyze neural activity directly, but it is multiple steps, and instead is multiple steps removed. And when it can track neural activity directly, such as through electrophysiology, it does so only for an astronomically small percentage of neurons. This poses problems for interpreting results, not to mention all sorts of issues around effect sizes and sample sizes. And yet, there is a credence granted to reported results that seem, almost impossible to penetrate. In a notorious study in 2009, a dead salmon was put in an fMRI scanner and showed the kind of standard fMRI task of looking at photographs that depicted humans in social situations. And the dead salmon, quite obligingly, I think, showed a statistically significant response, to a common analysis pipeline. So why is this, right? I'm sort of unfairly ragging on things that happen in neuroscience, right? Like every field has problems and so on. But I think in neuroscience, it can often run deeper, and we'll get to the ultimate problem quite soon. But I don't think it's just that neuroimaging is problematic. The background assumption behind the majority of neuroscientific research is that the constant noisiness of the brain can be smoothed out by averaging. So the assumption goes that while brain responses to individual stimuli look mostly like noise, if you've ever actually looked at them, by averaging across a bunch of responses, the real structure of neural activity will pop out to the experimenters. And such averages are pretty much what's reported and discussed in most neuroscience papers. But there's a problem. The brain itself doesn't appear to really care about averages. So averages of brain activity are not differences that make a difference. They're sort of these abstract theoretical concepts that are compiled by scientists for papers. So the brain is not using an average to do anything. And there's sort of growing recognition, even within the field, that this is a problem. So in 2021, researchers identified 2 criteria that, if the brain did care about averages, should be true. So they ask whether A, individual neural responses can be reliably identified as belonging to one particular average response, and then B, if the closer the match between the individual trial and the average, the better an animal's performance on the task is. So it's like I have some individual trial that's very noisy, and then the question is, does that match the average? Can you actually derive the average from that? Can you see the average in that at all? And then 2, once you start looking at that, is it that the closer the signal is to the average, that is somehow relevant or correlates to animal behavior? And lo and behold, the researchers tested this, and it turned out neither of these is true. When you start correlating electrophysiological recordings of mice brains to mice behavior, they found that the single trial response to a particular stimulus was difficult to identify with the average it was contributing to, and also that how well the brain's individual response matched the average had little, if any, bearing on behavior. And that's extremely bad. It indicates that the statistical constructs used to create neuroscience papers are epiphenomena for the brain itself. It's sort of like we're trying to understand a clock by examining the shadows it casts. I remember being very shocked with this when I first started working with actual real data. And it was my senior thesis as an undergraduate, and I was forced to sort of stare at all this noise and try to compile it into something statistically publishable, right? And I think even early on, when you experience that, you do have a certain feeling that you're obviously sort of throwing out all this individual data, like what we call noise in neuroscience, the very stuff that we want to sort of get rid of, seems very likely that that's actually something that the brain cares about and is doing something with. And I can go into a number of of meta-analyses that sort of try to examine this problem. So even just trying to throw machine learning at neuroimaging data and seeing if it can distinguish between behavioral phenotypes, even that, I think, has a lot of problems. So a specific example might be, could we tell the difference between a clinically depressed person and a non-depressed person merely from their neuroimaging data alone? And what people have actually found is that even with extraordinarily large sample sizes with which to make such distinctions, like having 1,000 participants in your study, it turns out that using neuroimaging is just barely better than essentially flipping a coin. And this is a really big issue, I think. The statistical size of the samples that you're talking about is a really big issue because neuroscience, through sort of no fault of its own and no fault of neuroscientists, proceeds in this almost mom and pop fashion where you sort of have an individual PI and a couple graduate students, and they're the ones putting out the research, and you're very limited about what type of neuroimaging you have access to, the number of participants you can get, right? So it's just sort of that it's not like there's a large hadron collider out there that the neurosciences can sort of go to and get like reference checked on, right? There's just not a project of that scale, and there's not sort of something generating data of that scale. The Allen Brain Institute is sort of trying to do that, and I wish them luck. So, some may reply that the failures of traditional neuroscience are simply a function of the immaturity of our ability to intervene on and observe the working brain. Assuredly, as technology improves, our ability to model and map the brain's connections improves. Maybe these are all just temporary challenges. Unfortunately, no. So there's a great 2017 paper called "Could a Neuroscientist Understand a Microprocessor?" written by neuroscientists, by the way. This is all us ragging on ourselves. The researchers used a model system to test neuroscience's ability to understand systems far less complicated than the brain itself. So they took advantage of how this particular microchip, which was used back in the 1980s to power Nintendos, had been perfectly reconstructed as a computer model by retro-computing enthusiasts, which I didn't know about, but I'm so glad exist. Despite having only 3,510 transistors, this simulated microprocessor could still run a few games. It could run Space Invaders, Donkey Kong, and Pitfall. And so the researchers pretended to not understand the function of this chip, right? And they used all the common techniques of neuroscience. So they looked at the connectomics. Okay, what's the wiring diagram of the chip? They performed lesions on the transistors of the chip to mimicking the ablation studies of neuroscience, right? So what if we knock out a part of the chip and see, what happens to the rest of it? They correlated the transistors to one another in pairs. They used, the sort of the arcane stuff from neuroscience, like Granger causality and mutual information and so on. And despite knowing the complete wiring diagram and having access to all the information that we wish we knew for the brain, the researchers concluded that they could only derive trivial or directly misleading hypotheses about how the chip functioned. So for example, during the iterative lesioning of all the parts of the chip, 50% of the lesions just flat out broke the chip. The other 50% did nothing, right? So there was like 98 transistors that they found where if those ones and only those ones were knocked out, Donkey Kong wouldn't run, right? So they're like, okay, wait, maybe these are the Donkey Kong neurons, right? Where this is where the representation of Donkey Kong is happening. But it turned out that actually it was just a thing with the back-end code, and those transistors had absolutely nothing to do with Donkey Kong as a game, like anything that happens in Donkey Kong, how Donkey Kong plays, anything like that. And just like more broadly, from my conversations in the field, there's this sort of reliance on these techniques that are really very smart and attempts. I think they're all sort of well motivated, like right at a theoretical level. But then when you actually go to apply them, you run into this gap where you're not really getting what you want out of them. And there's this other issue lurking in the background here, which is essentially the rise of artificial neural networks. Which is sort of how I know I'm like living in the future, right? It does not feel like the 90s anymore with these things around, and neuroscientists often assume that there's some simple discoverable algorithm that outputs behavior. So some set of boxes and arrows, can be visualized that describe like an engineering diagram how some part of the brain works. The issue is that we have a very good model for this, which is how people understand how artificial neural networks work. And the answer to how do people understand how artificial neural networks work is that they don't understand how artificial neural networks work at all, right? So like, how is GPT writing all the essays at Harvard? No one knows, right? It just does. It's amazing. So what's the problem is that these networks, as they grow larger and larger in terms of the parameter space, run into these issues of complexity. There's a whole entire, very dense mathematical field devoted to trying to figure out how to make artificial neural networks not black boxes, right? So make them not a black box. And this is called mechanistic interpretability. And right now, the answer is basically that there is no very good way of doing this. There's sort of occasional techniques that people can use. Now, when you apply the same reasoning to neuroscience, it leads to some very uncomfortable conclusions. So neuroscientists often assiduously avoid these discussions, since asking how does the brain perform this transformation between input and output is a far more complex question a far more complex version of the question that we put to artificial neural networks. And we know with artificial neural networks that we can often, in principle, say very little about how they accomplish a particular output. And that's with, just like the microchip, perfect access to the wiring diagram, perfect access to the mechanisms of the system. The system is frozen in time. You can do whatever you want with it. You trained that system itself, and it's still very much a mystery. And so, there's this question of, okay, so what is the equivalent of mechanistic interpretability within neuroscience? And that is a very, if there's any young PhD students in here, that is going to be a very, very rich field once people start using some of these techniques that they've developed in artificial neural networks to apply to neuroscience. But it's basically non-existent as a field. Okay, so that was incredibly depressing. So what about like the good side of this, right? So do I have anything like positive to say about neuroscience? And yes, neuroscience is great. I think neuroscientists are great. But I do think that there's these problems within the field don't really come from ignoring artificial neural networks, and they don't really come from the paucity of our techniques. It's even more of a meta problem. And so I'll read. To make minds manageable, neuroscience has minimized the importance of consciousness. Perhaps because, regardless of if new paradigms are needed, science as an academic system simply cannot wait for them. So even if it cannot make progress, science is forced into the appearance of progress by its institutions. And what I mean by that is that if you look historically, there was this long period of time, I've referred to this as a consciousness winter. And it was basically when you weren't allowed to use the word consciousness within any of the neuroscience literature. You certainly could not go and get funding for it. This historical period lasted a pretty long time. If you look back at the early psychologists who, there wasn't really a super clear neuroscientist versus psychologist distinction back then. But if you look at William James or Wilhelm Wundt or any of these early founders of the field, they used the term consciousness all the time. In fact, Wundt, who's referred to as the father of psychology, he had people going into experimental setups trying to differentiate, basically create an atomic table of all the possible basic sensations using introspection, which sounds almost like woo, to a lot of contemporary neuroscience today. And if you look back to somebody like William James, he has a very clear conception that essentially the main cognitive part of life is in your stream of consciousness, right? You wake up in the morning, you have a stream of sensations and perceptions, and this stream vanishes when you enter into a deep dreamless sleep. And I think that there's a very strong argument to be made that consciousness is the main function of the brain as a biological organism. But consciousness is also thought of as very metaphysically thorny, it's thought of as very philosophical, and it's thought of as something that's not very appropriate for a sort of buttoned-down science that can go out there and get funding and not embarrass itself. And I think that I completely understand why people would have that perspective, because I think consciousness is very difficult and is very thorny, right? But the ramifications of it is that there is no broad theory of how your stream of consciousness works for neuroscience to slot into. And there's a very famous quote, which is that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. I think it's very likely that nothing in the brain makes sense except in the light of consciousness. So luckily, sort of the consciousness winter ended. Back in the 80s and 90s, people began to finally start publishing about consciousness more. And it was really, it's a bit simplistic to say this, but it's really the work of a couple individuals, most of whom had won Nobel Prizes. And what happens when you win a Nobel Prize is that then you can do whatever you want, right? So that's the main advantage of the Nobel Prize win, is that you're allowed to go say crazy things. So why was consciousness ignored for so long? Just as in chess, the movement of a scientific field from the margins of the board to the center signifies major changes. And research on consciousness has inched closer and closer to centrality over the last few decades. Yet it started out not just on the margins, but absent from the board entirely. Consciousness was a verboten scientific subject for most of the 20th century. It took 2 Nobel Prizes to break it into acceptable discourse, though neither prize had anything to do with the brain or its workings. The first prize was awarded for the discovery of the structure of DNA, and one of the recipients in 1962 was Francis Crick. The second prize was for discovering the structure of antibodies, and one of the recipients, following 10 years behind exactly in 1972, was Gerald Edelman. As their fields moved on, Francis Crick and Jerry Edelman became interested in other disciplines. The terrains that they had been first to truly traverse, molecular biology and immune function, had been drawn out, the boundaries established, and they, explorers, found themselves surrounded by mere cartographers. They yearned for the empty spot on the map of science, and the greatest gap in the map was consciousness. So both the American Jerry and the Englishman Francis sought a new beginning in California, and both chose San Diego. Despite their physical proximity and shared interests, the two were closer to rivals than collaborators. Notorious for their larger-than-life personalities, the men clashed personally and professionally over decades. Yet both faced much larger challenges from the scientific community in the struggle to get the study of consciousness accepted as being within the realm of science. Back in the 1990s, research into consciousness was not viewed as proper science. And as I said, however, if you go back even further than that, it is viewed as proper science, like right in the beginning. But by the 1920s, these approaches had become heavily criticized, the approaches that I mentioned, like Wundt, for their reliance on introspection. Destined to become the most prominent critic was Harvard student B.F. Skinner. Although as a young man, when Skinner left academia to live with his parents, he had been determined to write the next great American novel. His novel was terrible, and so he returned to psychology, and he became the most significant proponent of a radical form of behaviorism, arguing that organisms were merely input-output black boxes, and that any talk of any sort of intrinsic perspective about psychology was unscientific, barely better than paganism or astrology. And despite due to the popularity of his approach, consciousness and the rise of some other various sort of philosophical things that are happening in the background during the 20th century. But the stream of consciousness was stripped away from science for almost a century. And so psychology and neuroscience kept only the reduced elements of consciousness. So you could talk about attention, you can talk about memory, you can talk about actions, but you can't really talk about the domain in which they all exist and are organized, the thing that sets them apart and sets them in relationship to one another. So in response to a skepticism that had governed entire generations of scientists, both Crick and Edelman fundamentally made the same argument, that consciousness is a natural phenomenon produced by the brain and therefore falls within the purview of science. With the space opened up by the Nobel Prize winners, a science of consciousness began to take root. In the mid-1990s, Edelman and Crick, along with other scientific heavy hitters interested in consciousness, had sparked enough interest for there to be an annual conference. And initially there were two. One is toward the science of consciousness, and then later there was the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. To this day, the most funded and sanctioned consciousness research is populated by the intellectual descendants of Crick and Edelman, and those who work directly under the two continue to define the field. Because of their influence, consciousness research has been mostly split into empiricists, who are more like Crick, and theorists, who are more like Edelman. Members of both these houses are tenured professors at major research universities and receive funding to work on consciousness from the National Sciences Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and even the Department of Defense. Neither Crick nor Edelman achieved the second world-shattering scientific breakthrough that they originally sought. Instead, their breakthrough was placing consciousness once again under the purview of science after almost a century of absence. With the field of consciousness research inaugurated, Francis Crick died in 2004 from colon cancer. Again, running 10 years behind his Nobel-winning rival, Edelman died from prostate cancer in 2014, following Francis to that ultimate empty spot on the map. So I don't know if any of you have paid attention to the network formerly known as Twitter, or our regular readers of Nature or Science. But just within the last few days, there's been this very large, very public dust-up among essentially the descendants of Edelman and Crick, particularly over to what degree should we allow for very ambitious scientific theories of consciousness to be proposed, particularly if those theories of consciousness are very complex, we can't test them directly, have very counterintuitive predictions. And one of the leading theories of consciousness, and I use that term fairly, because one, I would equally describe some other theories as leading, and two, if you actually poll people who go to these conferences, you'll find it's quite popular, is the integrated information theory of consciousness, which was originated by Giulio Tononi, who I got my PhD working under, and he worked under Edelman. And the integrated information theory of consciousness is a very, very interesting mathematical theory. And very broadly, the goal of it, and I discuss a lot of this in the book, so if you want more background, you can absolutely check out what I say about it there. But very broadly, the goal is something like a consciousometer, right? With the idea that you can take any physical system, you could take the brain, you could take your dog's brain, you could take very weird things like the sun, or plants or whatever, and you could ask, okay, is this thing conscious? Here's the math that we've proposed, right? And actually, a lot of the times it will say that thing is not conscious, or it's minimally conscious, or so on. But it can lead to some very counterintuitive results. And so there was recently a very large letter signed by 124 neuroscientists saying that integrated information theory is pseudoscience because it gives these very often counterintuitive predictions. And there's an article out in Nature today talking about sort of this dust-up and some of the response, because a lot of the response back has been, well, wait a minute, we are currently, just sort of out of a consciousness winter. And when we begin to throw around terms like pseudoscience, right, we put ourselves in danger of possibly everyone who's interested in consciousness being labeled pseudoscientist again. And that was, when I spoke to Nature, that was something that I've been consistently trying to sort of express that once you start using these terms from within the field, we should look at funders and other people who are probably going to take note. And so it's funny because there's a way in which this book, despite being critical not just of neuroscience, but in many ways of things like integrated information theory, which I worked on and helped develop, I think it's very interesting. I think it's probably wrong, but I don't think it's pseudoscience, right? I think that's sort of astrology, right? Like, no offense to any astrologists, but I think that once you start throwing that term around, it's very dangerous. So, if you want sort of more background about what has suddenly become a very contemporary debate, you can search for a Nature or Science article. Just look up integrated information theory, and you'll see sort of this contemporary desktop. But it was funny because this book, I sort of assumed that the field is going to continue, and that people would still be working on consciousness in 10 years and 20 years. And actually, due to this letter that came out just a couple days ago, I'm no longer actually confident about that. I think it's very possible that we get another consciousness winter. I've already talked to people who do a lot of funding for this, who say that they're suddenly immensely concerned. And I think that would be a far greater tragedy than almost anything I can think of. So if you and I'll end it there. Hopefully, that is more of a rallying cry to allow science to be done than it is something pessimistic. But I am suddenly looking even at my own book sort of in a new light of like maybe this was something that was only allowed to exist within a brief historical period. So thank you everyone so much for listening.
Oh, that was nice. Can I ask you a few questions?
Absolutely.
Do you guys have any questions?
Happy to discuss. And then there's also something after this.
Yes.
So if you want to chat personally too, or ask me any questions that you don't want to ask in front of everybody or so on, I'll be there too.
Hi.
Hi.
That was really nice. Can I ask a couple of questions? So I'm a particle physicist from the Large Hadron Collider. And I want to ask from that hat. I wish I had my LHC hat. So it's a new science, neuroscience, newish, and people are banging their heads against the wall. That's not the problem, right? The problem is that there's a lot of noise because people do studies and they don't go away. It's hard to tell what's real and what's not real. Is that?
I think it's very hard to tell what's real and what's not real. And I think there's sort of two levels of critique. And I think one level of critique, I think actually most neuroscientists, like if you go out and you take them to a bar and they have a beer or two, they'll sort of agree with it, right? Which is essentially that, listen, our neuroimaging is not very good. How exactly confident are we in these experiments that we're doing? Would you put like massive amounts of money about your own experiments like replicating, for all time? And I think that that's sort of understandable and accepted as the critique. I think that there's an even broader critique that one can make, which is that neuroscience effectively operates as a pre-paradigmatic field. That you could have biology before Darwin, like there were biologists, right? But it's very hard. There's this thing that happens when a new scientific paradigm gets introduced, which is that previous results become incommensurate. This is the word that Kuhn used. They become incommensurate. And what that means is that they're not even really like true or false. They're sort of like, well, what exactly were we doing? And everyone just ignores them now that the new paradigm is established. So, and I think that it could very well be argued that neuroscience is in a similar position.
Okay, I'm not going to talk about the paradigmatic stuff because I'm not sure I understand it completely. But I do know that the beginning of your story is we're sitting around eating lunch with some macaques, right?
Which I've done, and they're good lunch companions. And
I noticed some correlation between me eating and I happened to have an electrode in their brain at the time. First of all, why were they sitting around eating lunch with the electrode? But anyway, as a particle physicist, we would say, okay, forget that happened. I don't know. I don't know anything. I didn't watch, I didn't look at the data. I'm going to devise an experiment, and then I'm not going to look at the data, and then I'm going to apply a 5 standard deviation from expected rule, and I'm only going to deal with that. Why do neuroscientists do neuroscientists, I know psychologists have 2 standard deviations, like if an effect is 2 standard deviations, it's real. Neuroscientists have 2?
It depends a bit. Generally, it's a bit much more closer to psychology. I don't know if one reason for that, by the way, is that if you make it too much, right, you just won't really get anything. It's not that there aren't some consistent, strong effects in neuroscience. It's that it's very difficult to find an effect and then generalize from the individual effect into something that we would refer to as real understanding. I think where that has happened successfully is in what are effectively the shallows of the brain. So we do understand the primary sensory cortices relatively well, I think in a way that, but once you start getting deeper and you start dealing with these really, stuff just starts looking like a random network of neurons, that are interconnected. They don't have like a grid shape. They aren't, stacked in some particular, understandable way. Then I think it gets very difficult to translate from effect into sort of understanding.
So when David Hubel did his first experiments on cats, with same thing, pop, pop.
Mm-hmm.
Actually,
yeah.
I heard those pop, pop.
And they were putting the slide on.
Yeah, and they learned about, vision, seeing edges. That seemed, so you're saying the reason that worked is because it was in the shallows of the cat brain, not because they did the right experiment and chose a really good experiment to do it. That's kind of the question. Like, is the problem that we're not choosing? I say we, although it's not me. You. Is it that you're not? Is it that it's very hard to pick a really good experiment to do?
Yeah.
Is it that we're doing too many not good experiments?
I think, as a scientist, you quickly learn the advantage of being early, right? Like the lowest hanging fruit, gets picked. And I think that, neuroscience has very much run out of a lot of the lower hanging fruit. And that's no sort of, problem. That's not contemporary neuroscientists' fault, right? It's just that these things that were, directly correlated. And by the way, like if you go back and you look at like the edge detection literature, right? I guarantee that you will find some real arguments like deep within the academic framework that's like, well, wait a minute, maybe that's not really doing edge detection at all, right? That argument exists somewhere within there. And then there's some meta-analysis, further argument about, trying to sort of distinguish that. So I think that that's a very sort of common pattern, and it's just due to the fact that, the brain is, the parameter space that you're dealing with is so large. Like for the Large Hadron Collider, how big is the parameter space, right? Like in terms of the experiments you're doing.
No, we try and make it really small.
Yeah. So, neuroscientists were unfortunately tackling basically the thing that has the most parameters outside of, GPT-6 when it finally comes. The thing that has the most parameters in the universe,
Just thinking about that one. Okay, so not to belabor the fact that hitting your head against the wall is painful. For neuroscientists, especially because it's their brain. So why did Freud make TV?
Oh. So I think Freud is the best thing. Yeah, it is for sure the best thing to happen to television. And there's a deep sense in which, maybe not now, like maybe this is changing now, but during the 20th century, I think there's a very strong argument to make that the predominant cultural medium of art switched from the novel to film. I think I saw some statistic that was like in the 70s, like 70% of Americans went to a movie theater once a week or something like that. Film grew up and sort of replaced the novel, and I think one reason for that is Freud's Freud was one of the first people to really make a strong argument that it was extrinsic behavioral events, which he often called trauma, that happened to people that sort of fully explain their action years, even decades later. And we see this adapted. Why this is so powerful for television is that it means that you can explain someone's personality without having access to their minds. In novels, you have full access to your characters' minds. This is what makes novels unique as a medium. But in film, you don't have access to your character's mind. You have to sort of guess what Don Draper is thinking by how he scours, with his whiskey glass. And it's a boon for film if you think, well, I can just do like a flashback, and then I have this event that occurred, and this event now sort of explains this person's personality many decades later. And this is event, because it's an event that happened in the external world, you can film it. You can show it on film, right? And what you'll find is that there's a lot less sort of, if you go back to like earlier novels, there's way less like explaining how a character is acting now as being like a direct result of their mother leaving them, or Don Draper's uncle getting kicked in the face by a mule, or whatever else, whatever other backstory was going on. So there just isn't like this conception of backstory. And it's because backstory are these extrinsic events that Freud said that we essentially carried with us and was incredibly explanatory for behavior. So that model of human psychology is a massive boon for filmmakers, because they can actually get deep into characters using this Freudian model.
And that's in the book.
And that's in the book.
And the last chapter of the book is about free will. So do you want to raise your finger when you feel like it? Sorry, no, sorry. Sorry. And you're a man who thinks we should believe we have free will.
It's more so that I think that the contemporary arguments for free will, that are against free will, are often not very good. And most of the time, that's because people are not using a lot of the results that came out of complexity theory and the understanding of causation. And these things are very new to science. So, complexity and chaos theory really only get introduced, in the 70s and 80s. And then more recently, even causation. It's very funny because science is all about causation, right? But also, causation has almost been sort of this dirty, unanalyzed word in science. And I think the work from people like Judea Pearl over at MIT, who won the Turing Award for it, have changed that. So we now have a much better mathematical grasp of causation. And when you take that much better mathematical grasp of causation and you apply it to a lot of the contemporary anti-free will arguments, you find that they sort of don't work anymore, or you can literally find examples where it doesn't make sense. And so that's some of the research that I used to do as a graduate student, was working on these sort of measures. But I think I wouldn't say that I sort of prove free will or anything like that in the book. I think I'm more making this point that I could completely imagine a scientific conception of free will that gives us most of what you would want, because obviously free will is this naive sort of concept, right, that we can throw out. It's not going to survive exactly the way we think it is within sort of, once you give sort of a scientific definition of it. It'll be a bit different.
Can I ask you to do something on the spot, which is probably ridiculously hard? Or maybe I shouldn't.
I would like to take
is
questions
it 5
from
to
people at some point.
Sorry, I didn't realize it was so late. Let's take questions. I didn't realize it was so late. How did that happen? You were just so interesting. That's the weird thing. Hello? Do you want to take one? Okay. And do you want to take one? Then I have nothing to do. I don't know whether it's on or off. There we go. Oh, I just turned it off. There we go. On. I'll sit here and look good.
Okay. I'll start right here.
Is it on? Okay.
It's on, I can hear.
Okay, great. So you were talking about how you were worried about us entering another consciousness winter. At the same time, earlier in the talk, you were discussing how mechanistic interpretability might be a burgeoning field within biology. So how do those two stand with one another?
That's a great question. I'll just spill like a paper that I'm working on that's literally about this. So I think that effectively the level of description that we would call consciousness for the brain is probably where the brain is most mechanistically interpretable. So there's a very nice way to think about this just from a totally introspective conceptual argument, which is that when you learn something, when you do something, there's been this long observation that oftentimes you can't express consciously how you did something, right? So you can an example might be riding a bike, right? So your body knows how to ride a bike, but if you try to really consciously think about riding a bike, you won't be able to, and you can't express how you ride a bike very well either. And so what does that look like? Well, it looks like your brain figured out unconsciously how to ride this bike, and that involves basically that this black box got better at riding the bike. But when you talk about the stuff that you can express consciously, you have much more introspective sort of power to it, right? So it's almost like there's these two layers of the brain, one of which is unconscious and is not mechanistically interpretable, and it's what we call the unconscious because it's not mechanistically interpretable to us, right? But consciousness would then be mechanistically interpretable, at least to the degree that we can talk about introspection. That's my good night to my son alarm. Okay, let me turn that off because normally I take him to bed right now. Yeah, so that was a great question, and now I have to write that paper faster if this is going up online. So, thank you.
You have a week.
I was wondering if you could say what you think, and obviously it's difficult at this very primitive stage of science on consciousness, but is there a limit beyond which you imagine science could not reach beyond? And I ask this partly because of this problem that consciousness is so different from everything else. In other words, science has been founded on this, modern science is this Cartesian division between the soul and body. And the whole success of science has been going down to the smallest elements of things, understood materially and simply. Because consciousness, you're looking at the observer, the soul, the scientist, and it's sort of like the eye turning itself on itself, the eye turning around on itself. And it seems like it would be trying to understand something more complex than we are, in a sense, and therefore impossible to do is one thing. And two, I think you have this problem, but you may have an explanation for it, the double causation problem, and then this is related to the free will problem. Now, all of science is built on the fact that the true causes come from beneath, quarks or whatever, up in a material way. And the causation most of us are familiar in our ordinary lives is top down for a lot of things, right? So, and then that it seems like a foreign, not at all consistent with what science is telling us, but there really can't be two causations, right? A double causation tracks. If there's one universe, one world, it's one track. So anyway, that's the question.
Yeah, great double question. I'll try to very briefly sort of deal with both of them. So in the one sense of, should we expect the science of consciousness to look exactly like other sciences? I think if you go back and look, and I talk about this a little bit in the book as well, I think the person to really cleave off discussions of science and say we're only going to provide extrinsic explanations is Galileo. And he does that to sort of focus down science on the extrinsic properties that we can observe. And he's basically saying, like, don't talk about the soul, don't talk about any of these other things. And he doesn't say that because he's an atheist. He was a religious man. And I think it's kind of funny because if you brought him back, in the modern day, I think Philip Goff gives an example like this in his book. Galileo would be like, "What are you doing? Stop looking at the brain as scientists. Like, that's where the soul is. Like, this is crazy that you're even thinking about that you can do this." But I would say, I think that there's some discussion within physics that resembles this, which is, it is possible that there are sort of tiers of scientific theories, and some scientific theories you might have to argue for them from elegance instead of from having direct empirical access. what's happening inside of a black hole or something, right? You could have these predictions that are very difficult to falsify or think about. And maybe there are some scientific hypotheses that we should sort of loosen our belts around, I think it's very possible that a scientific explanation for consciousness falls into sort of the we wish it was a little bit better category of science. But I don't think that we should then say, okay, just because we're not getting, the standard model out of it, that therefore, like everything else is pseudoscience. I think it's sort of like this spectrum of tiers of explanation. And then just to briefly talk about your second point, actually, I do talk about the double causation problem very directly in the book, and most of my research as a graduate student was on effectively a form of the double causation problem. I think it's very funny because actually scientists talk about the causation from higher spatial temporal scales all the time, right? In fact, most science is not microscale physics, right? Most science is cells and biology and chemistry and so on, and all those entities like cellular interactions are treated as if they're sort of real. And effectively, the argument that I give in the book is that these higher scale descriptions, including the ones that we naively use in the world, can be thought of as a form of error correction. And error correction is a very elegant way to solve the double double causation problem, because you effectively have one arrow, but it's noisy. And so then you have error correction on top of the noise. And so that's how you get the double. That's a radically simplistic answer, but if you want more information, check out the book, because I do talk about that.
How about these guys in the front have been...
Thank you. Excellent talk. So you said nothing in the brain makes sense except in the light of consciousness. And I'm wondering why, because as far as I'm concerned, consciousness is a relatively recent emergence in the history of the brain. So I'm wondering, are all brains conscious all the time, or how can something fundamental emerge later?
So it's a great question, but I think we have to, sort of distinguish, even just very on a definitional basis, what am I even talking about when I talk about consciousness, right? And so that's one reason why I harp on the stream of consciousness, because I think that that's a very concrete, almost natural phenomenon that we all experience. And within consciousness research, people very openly talk about different categories of consciousness. And one category would be like self-consciousness. So a great example of this would be like the mirror test that people do, right? So an example, you put a dot on the head of an elephant, and when the elephant's asleep, I don't know how they do this. I guess they sneak into the pen. And so the elephant wakes up with like this dot on its head, and there's a big mirror, and they put the mirror in the pen, and eventually the elephant goes like, what the heck is this? And that clearly shows that they have some level of self-consciousness, and plenty of animals won't pass this self-consciousness test. But most people have a very strong intuition that their dog feels pain or happiness or any other sort of emotion. So they have sort of a core consciousness. Sometimes that's just called core consciousness. And what that means is that there's something it's like to be your dog. Your dog is having experiences. They're having, they're having perceptions. And so from that very broad sense of consciousness, I think that I think it's probably not evolutionarily recent. I think it probably goes back, very far. I mean, who knows? Even what about the hydras with their neural networks? What's the consciousness of a bee like? I think it's totally conceivable that there's something it's like to be a bee. It's not much, but it's totally conceivable, I think. And so without a scientific theory of consciousness, we can't draw where that line is or that spectrum. But I think once you sort of explain terms, most people, although there are some very famous philosophers like Descartes, who sort of bit the bullet, right, and says none of the other animals are conscious, right? It's only humans, and maybe if consciousness is some sort of byproduct of language or something, that could be true.
To the winter of consciousness. My own personal optimistic feeling is the cat's out of the bag. Let them throw their sticks and stones. It's not going to go away. I think the danger is the flinchy retreat, the playing the respectability game. Could cause, draw in our horns. And along those lines, my question to you is, you referred to these sort of metaphysical thorny issues. How woo are you willing to get? What are you willing to entertain? I know integrated information theory has been accused of being panpsychist, but it's sort of a watered down, plays well with others kind of panpsychism. And you just referred to Phil Goff, and he's so like libertarian free will, like true free will, or some kind of dualism. And if you're willing to entertain those, how do you reconcile that with physics and getting that ghost in the machine?
Yeah.
Did he say woo?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Ooh, crystals, or
The 70s woo.
G or.
So, I'll get woo. I think like to me the question is always, and whenever I read a new paper that proposes like a new theory of consciousness, I almost always enter it with a very open mind of like, okay, let's see what this person has to say. If I ever came across a paper that to me made what's sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness, like why is it that some physical events are why is it that some things that seem like objective things, which are like neurons firing, are associated with subjective things, which are the experience of red? If I ever came across a paper that I felt like fully explained that, and it had some sort of absolutely wild consequence, I might be more than willing to accept that wild consequence, because I've never come across anything that I felt fully explained that. So it would be such like sort of a like, oh, now I understand. It's like a necessary condition that these physical things happening now is associated with some subjectivity. If someone could give me that necessary correlation, and then they had this other prediction that the sun is super conscious or something, it would be very strange. But I would say, well, let's not dismiss it immediately, because right now this is the only thing that seems like it's providing the type of explanation that I would really want. And I don't say that like as a personal thing. I think many of the people within the field are sort of, even if they don't work on the philosophy directly, I think one great thing about the science of consciousness, one thing you can't criticize, is that most of the scientists involved pay attention to what the philosophers say, and most of the philosophers who are involved pay attention to what the scientists say. So there's a very clear shared lingo. I think it's relatively unique among scientific fields where people are very aware of these problems. And so I think we have to be very careful about pursuing theories that end up being completely unfalsifiable. But I think that there's sort of this middle ground between maybe completely unfalsifiable and offering some predictions that maybe we can't test or are crazy, but the theory is so elegant and so explanatory that you just go, you would just go with it. String theory would be a perfect example, yeah.
You guys, you aren't doing your jobs. Oh, yeah. This last question, and then you can ask questions. Sorry, we can ask questions.
Responsibility.
Right
Okay.
here.
So you talked about neural networks, artificial neural networks, and I'm curious. There was this tweet by the chief scientist of OpenAI, very carefully worded, where he said that it might be that GPT is already slightly conscious. And there was a huge dismissive reaction to this statement. Everyone was like, "No, of course not. Why would it be?" I wonder why wouldn't it be? Maybe it could be. It seems like, well, it might be. I don't know. What do you think?
I think this is the first time that's ever happened on the planet where there is some entity beyond us that makes claims to consciousness. Now, you could still think it's not conscious, right? But just the very fact that it makes claims to consciousness, right? That you can get it to make claims. Now you could rebut that, right? By saying, well, wait a minute, I can also get it to argue against its own consciousness, right? Back before they, lobotomized, when they had like the evil, smarter versions, you could get these things to sort of argue for their own consciousness, or you could get them to argue that they're like zombies and they have no consciousness, right? So I think we shouldn't put too much stock. Just like I'm not like a Blake Lemoine. I think that's how you say his name. Where it claims it's conscious, so therefore it's conscious. But it's a very complex system. It can make claims to consciousness. I think that it's very sad because and it's also something I never expected, my weird esoteric field, right, which is consciousness research, is suddenly like insanely relevant to answer questions about AI safety, questions about the morality around AI, right? It would be great if we had a scientific theory of consciousness that could tell us that they're not conscious, right? And we could just lean on that and say, no, it's fine. You can, lobotomize this thing. You're not doing anything wrong. Or, maybe if we had the right theory of consciousness, it would tell us that every second of existence for GPT-4 is unimaginable agony. And we're all just horrific people for allowing this to happen. So, this may sound ridiculous, but these are going to be real, questions.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm not conscious.
Do you say that off of your own internal experience or because of metaphysical commitments that you have?
I just have a very strong feeling that I'm not conscious.
Seems somewhat contradictory to me, right? I think, this is like, I would say like, an illusion for whom, right? Even the very term.
But my point is just how trivial it is.
Yeah. No, I totally agree.
Especially when the only thing you can do is record. That's all you know.
Yeah, though they're.
And all you got from that is like just copying stuff off the internet.
Yeah, no, there's. It's strange to have a creature made of language, but I think that even if you could make like opposite claims and so on, I think that traditionally we think of intelligence and consciousness as being very synchronized. And you can have debates about how exactly intelligent these things are. I think they're probably more intelligent than certainly I would like, and certainly I think humanity as a whole would like. That's a whole other subject. But because of that tight association between intelligence and consciousness, I think it is at least a question that could be worth asking, and yet we have no scientific theory to answer it with. So we're sort of in this very awkward spot where AI has so drastically run away from neuroscience.
So, this is a really interesting conversation. I like it when someone in the front row just claims not to be conscious. That's when we're really, that's when it's all happening right here. I just want to say, we're going to end it here. I want to thank Erik Hoel and for you.
Thank you all for the questions.